Daniel Walker leaned back in his sleek office chair, a triumphant grin stretching across his face. The glow of his oversized monitor illuminated his sharp features as he clicked the confirm button, sealing yet another lucrative deal for his company. Another day, another milestone, he muttered, his tone dripping with self-satisfaction. Daniel, a self-made millionaire and one of Chicago's most influential entrepreneurs, prided himself on always being one step ahead. His moment of triumph was interrupted by a soft knock at the door. "Come in," Daniel barked, his patience already wearing thin. His assistant, Mia, stepped in, clutching a tablet. "Mr. Walker," she began timidly. "Mr. Green is here for your 2 p.m. meeting." Daniel waved dismissively. "Fine, show him in." Moments later, Alex Green entered, a man in his late 40s with salt and pepper hair and an air of confidence. He carried a portfolio, but his expression betrayed a hint of unease. "What is it, Green?" Daniel asked curtly, barely looking up from his screen. Alex cleared his throat. "I wanted to remind you about tomorrow night's networking event at Bravura. It's that exclusive new spot downtown. The guest list is pretty impressive." Daniel's interest was piqued. He finally glanced up, folding his hands on the desk. "Who are we talking about?" "Well," Alex replied cautiously, "I've heard the CEO of Axis Innovations will be attending, along with other potential investors for your expansion." A sly smile crept across Daniel's face. "Perfect. The stage is set for me to make my mark. They'll see exactly why Daniel Walker is a force to be reckoned with." Alex shifted nervously. "It's a great opportunity, sir, but I'd advise—" Daniel cut him off with a wave of his hand. "Save it, Green. Just make sure everything is flawless. Oh, and have the driver prepare the Escalade. I want to arrive in style." "Of course, Mr. Walker," Alex replied, bowing slightly before leaving the room. Alone again, Daniel gazed out of the floor-to-ceiling windows of his corner office. The Chicago skyline stretched out before him, a testament to his ambition and dominance. "This city is mine," he whispered to his reflection. "And tomorrow, I'll remind everyone why." Across town, Grace Harper leaned back in her modest yet stylish office chair, letting out a sigh of relief. The CEO of a thriving nonprofit, Grace had just wrapped up a grueling day of meetings and decisions. The organization she helmed, HeartReach, was dedicated to providing education and resources to underserved communities, a mission close to her heart. She stood, smoothing the lines of her tailored navy dress. Grace was not one for flashy displays of wealth, despite her considerable success. Her mother's voice echoed in her mind. True leadership is about service, not showmanship. On her way to the elevator, Grace paused by the cubicles where the janitorial staff was beginning their evening shift. "Good evening, Ms. Harper," called out Sophia, a middle-aged woman wiping down a desk. "Good evening, Sophia," Grace replied warmly. "How's your daughter enjoying her new school?" Sophia's face lit up. "She loves it, ma'am. Thank you again for helping us secure that scholarship." Grace's heart swelled with gratitude. These small moments were why she worked tirelessly. It wasn't about accolades or influence. It was about impacting lives. On her drive to Bravura, Grace reflected on the challenges of the day. She had turned down a significant corporate donation because the company's values clashed with HeartReach's mission. It was a difficult decision, but she knew it was the right one. Pulling into the valet, she smiled softly. Tonight was her chance to unwind and recharge. Upon entering Bravura, Grace was greeted by the maitre d' with a warm smile. "Ms. Harper, your usual table?" "Yes, thank you, Richard," she replied, her voice soft yet commanding. Seated in a quiet corner, Grace ordered her meal and allowed herself a moment of peace. The stresses of the day seemed to fade as she sipped her herbal tea. Her thoughts drifted to her late mother's words of wisdom, the cornerstone of her life and leadership. "Kindness is not a weakness, Grace. It's your greatest strength." Daniel Walker strode into Bravura, his custom Italian loafers clicking against the marble floors. The understated luxury of the restaurant suited him perfectly, reinforcing his sense of belonging among the city's elite. As he surveyed the room, his gaze fell on a lone figure sitting at a corner table. Grace Harper. Daniel's brow furrowed. Though her presence was subtle, something about her serenity seemed out of place in this temple of affluence. "What is she doing here?" he muttered under his breath, his annoyance growing. Taking his seat, Daniel couldn't resist casting glances toward Grace. To him, her understated dress and lack of expensive accessories seemed incongruous with the upscale clientele. His irritation simmered, feeding into his own biases. Unable to contain his disdain, Daniel leaned toward a waiter passing by. "Is this place lowering its standards?" he asked loudly, ensuring the comment reached nearby tables. "It feels like they're letting just anyone in these days." The waiter, caught off guard, mumbled an apology and hurried away. Grace, who had overheard every word, felt a pang of sadness. She recognized Daniel instantly. His reputation for arrogance and sharp business tactics was well known, but instead of reacting, she chose to stay composed. Daniel's words became louder, more pointed. "I mean, look at her," he scoffed, gesturing toward Grace. "Does she even know how to navigate a menu like this? Probably here on someone else's dime." Grace took a steadying breath, her fingers tightening around her teacup. She could feel the eyes of other patrons on her, but she refused to let his words define her or ruin her evening. Daniel's comments carried across the room, cutting through the quiet murmur of conversations. A few diners shifted uncomfortably in their seats, casting furtive glances toward Grace's table. Others avoided looking altogether, clearly unwilling to get involved. Grace remained poised, her expression calm despite the sting of humiliation that settled deep in her chest. Years of experience had taught her how to weather moments like these with dignity. She thought back to her early days at Heartreach, when dismissive comments and doubt from potential donors were a regular occurrence. Back then, it had hurt more. Now she understood that people's cruelty often said more about their insecurities than it did about her worth. Grace sipped her tea slowly, letting the warm liquid soothe her, and reminded herself to stay grounded. This wasn't the first time she had been underestimated, and it likely wouldn't be the last. Daniel, emboldened by the lack of confrontation, leaned back in his chair and smirked. "You know, it's people like her that ruin the exclusivity of places like this," he remarked loudly to the waiter who had just delivered his first course. "Bravura used to have standards." The waiter offered a polite smile and hurried off, clearly uncomfortable with the exchange. Daniel's gaze swept over the room, silently daring anyone to challenge him. Most of the other diners kept their eyes on their plates, though their discomfort was palpable. A few exchanged awkward whispers, their stolen glances bouncing between Daniel and Grace. Grace's thoughts turned to her mother, whose unwavering belief in leading by example had shaped her approach to life. She recalled her mother's steady voice. "Grace, when others try to tear you down, show them that your strength comes from lifting others up." Her mother's wisdom had guided her through countless trials, and it would guide her now. Grace straightened her shoulders and placed her hands on the table, focusing on her breathing to remain calm. She didn't need to defend herself against Daniel's insults, nor did she feel the urge to retaliate. Instead, she considered the value of patience, even in moments like this. Every fiber of her being told her that his words were rooted in ignorance, not truth. The restaurant's tension grew as the scene continued. Grace's silent composure seemed to unsettle Daniel more than if she had responded outright. His smirk faltered slightly, replaced by a flicker of confusion, as though he couldn't understand why she wasn't reacting. Meanwhile, at a table a few feet behind Daniel, a distinguished man in his late 50s observed the exchange. He dabbed at his lips with a cloth napkin and pushed his empty plate aside, his sharp blue eyes narrowing thoughtfully. Marcus Darnell, the CEO of Axis Innovations, and one of the most influential figures in the city, had chosen Bravura tonight to quietly assess the character of Daniel Walker before committing to a potential partnership. He had hoped for a promising display of professionalism. What he witnessed instead left him deeply disappointed. Marcus leaned back in his chair, watching Grace with admiration. He had met her at a community fundraiser several years ago and had been impressed by her intelligence, humility, and drive. Seeing her now, handling Daniel's blatant disrespect with such grace, only deepened his respect for her. He decided it was time to step in. Marcus rose from his seat and walked toward Daniel's table with measured steps. The room fell even quieter as diners recognized the powerful figure who was now at the center of the tension. Daniel looked up as Marcus approached, and his confident demeanor faltered. He had spent weeks strategizing how to impress Marcus, and now, here he was, standing before him. Daniel's mind raced, unsure if this was an opportunity or a reprimand. "Mr. Walker," Marcus said, his voice calm but commanding. "May I join you for a moment?" He didn't wait for an answer, instead pulling out a chair and sitting across from Daniel. "Of course, Mr. Darnell," Daniel stammered, hastily setting his utensils down. "It's an honor to have you here tonight. I wasn't expecting—" Marcus raised a hand to cut him off. "I couldn't help but overhear your commentary about Miss Harper," he said, his tone measured but firm. "I'd like to discuss that." Daniel's throat tightened. "Oh, you mean—" He glanced toward Grace, his face flushing. "I was just making an observation. Nothing personal, of course." Marcus tilted his head slightly, his piercing gaze never leaving Daniel. "I think you're mistaken. Your remarks weren't just personal. They were also revealing, and not in a way that reflects well on you." Daniel's confidence began to crumble. I didn't mean to," he started, but Marcus cut him off again. "Let me tell you something about Miss Harper," Marcus said, his voice calm yet laced with authority. "She's the CEO of HeartReach, an organization that has done more to improve lives in this city than most companies combined. She's a respected leader, a philanthropist, and someone whose work I hold in the highest regard. And yet, despite your blatant disrespect, she has chosen to rise above your behavior tonight." Daniel's face turned pale as Marcus's words sank in. He glanced toward Grace, who was still seated at her table, her calm demeanor unshaken. He realized too late that his arrogance had led him to misjudge her, and worse, to insult her in front of one of the most important figures in his professional life. The room seemed to hold its collective breath as Marcus continued. "Your actions tonight, Mr. Walker, have shown me something about your character. You see, success isn't defined by wealth or status. It's defined by how you treat others, especially those who can do nothing for you in return. And based on what I've seen tonight, I'm not sure your definition aligns with mine." Daniel sat frozen, his mind scrambling for a response. The confidence he had brought into the restaurant was now completely shattered, replaced by a growing sense of dread. Marcus turned his attention to Grace, who had quietly risen from her seat and now approached their table. Her expression remained calm, her poise unshaken, but her presence carried a quiet strength that commanded the room's respect. "Ms. Harper," Marcus said, standing as she approached, "it's a pleasure to see you again. Please join us." Grace inclined her head slightly. "Thank you, Mr. Darnell, but I believe I'll let you finish your conversation. It's been a long day, and I have an early start tomorrow." She turned to Daniel, her gaze steady but devoid of malice. "Mr. Walker," she said softly, "I hope tonight gives you something to reflect on. Success is fleeting, but character endures." With those words, Grace nodded politely to Marcus and walked toward the exit. The soft click of her heels against the marble floor echoed in the stillness, each step a reminder of the dignity she carried with her. As she reached the door, she paused and glanced back one last time, her eyes meeting Daniel's. For a moment, there was no anger, no judgment, only a glimmer of hope that he might learn from this experience. Then she was gone, leaving Daniel to face the silence and the weight of his actions. Daniel sat in stunned silence, the echoes of Grace's final words reverberating through his mind. Around him, the restaurant had resumed its normal hum, but to Daniel, everything felt distant, muted. He stared down at his plate, suddenly feeling like the room had grown smaller, the walls pressing in on him. The air, once scented with the aroma of gourmet dishes, now felt heavy and suffocating. Marcus remained seated across from him, his composed demeanor a stark contrast to Daniel's unraveling state. The weight of Marcus's disappointment hung in the air, palpable and unrelenting. Daniel opened his mouth to speak, but his throat was dry, and the words wouldn't come. Marcus sighed softly, breaking the silence. "Mr. Walker," he said, his tone measured but firm, "this could have been an evening of opportunity for you. A chance to demonstrate not just your business acumen, but the kind of person you are. Instead, what I've seen tonight raises serious doubts about your understanding of leadership and respect." Daniel swallowed hard, his face reddening. "Mr. Darnell, I made a mistake," he stammered, his voice barely audible. "I didn't know who she was, and That's precisely the problem," Marcus interjected, his piercing gaze cutting through Daniel's excuses. "Respect shouldn't depend on knowing someone's title or accomplishments. It should be a default setting. The fact that you only regret your behavior now that you know who Ms. Harper is speaks volumes." Daniel's jaw tightened as he absorbed Marcus's words. Each one felt like a hammer blow, chipping away at the carefully constructed facade of his confidence. He had spent years building his reputation, convincing himself that power and success were measured by wealth and status. But tonight, that belief had been shattered, and the cracks were impossible to ignore. "I don't think I can adequately convey how much I regret my behavior tonight," Daniel said finally, his voice trembling with genuine remorse. "You're right, Mr. Darnell. I let my arrogance blind me, and I acted in a way that's beneath the standards I should hold myself to. I'll do better." Marcus leaned back in his chair, studying Daniel closely. There was a flicker of sincerity in Daniel's words, but Marcus knew that remorse alone wouldn't be enough. Change required more than just an apology. It required action, reflection, and a willingness to confront the hard truths about oneself. "I hope you mean that, Mr. Walker," Marcus said after a long pause. "But words without action are meaningless. I suggest you take some time to truly reflect on what happened tonight and what it says about your values. Because if you want to be the kind of person others trust and respect, you'll need to start by earning it." Daniel nodded, his head hanging low. He felt like a chastened schoolboy, stripped of his usual bravado. "I understand," he murmured. "Thank you for your honesty, Mr. Darnell." Marcus stood, straightening his suit jacket. "I'll leave you to your thoughts, Mr. Walker. I suggest you use this time wisely." With that, he turned and walked away, leaving Daniel alone at the table. The rest of the evening passed in a haze for Daniel. He barely touched his meal, the once exquisite flavors now tasteless on his tongue. As other diners finished their meals and the restaurant began to empty, Daniel remained seated, lost in a storm of regret and self-recrimination. The image of Grace's composed face lingered in his mind, a stark reminder of everything he had failed to be. When he finally left Bravura, the night air hit him like a splash of cold water. The usual satisfaction he felt after a successful evening was nowhere to be found. Instead, he felt hollow, his carefully curated world of power and prestige suddenly seeming fragile and insubstantial. Back at his penthouse, Daniel poured himself a glass of scotch and sank into the plush leather chair in his living room. The city skyline stretched out before him, its glittering lights a stark contrast to the darkness he felt inside. He took a long sip of his drink, the burn doing little to numb the ache of self-awareness. For the first time in years, Daniel allowed himself to reflect on his actions, not just tonight, but throughout his career. He thought about the countless times he had dismissed or belittled others, the arrogance that had driven his success but also isolated him from genuine connection. He thought about the people he had hurt along the way, their faces blurring together in a haze of forgotten names and broken relationships. Daniel set his glass down and leaned forward, resting his head in his hands. The weight of his regret was overwhelming, but beneath it, there was a flicker of something else, a desire to change, to rebuild himself into someone he could be proud of, not just for his accomplishments, but for the way he treated others. The next morning, Daniel sat at his desk, staring blankly at the computer screen. The spreadsheets and emails that usually commanded his attention now seemed trivial, their urgency drowned out by the echo of Marcus's words. He knew he needed to do something tangible to show that he had learned from his mistakes. His assistant, Mia, knocked gently on the door before stepping inside. "Mr. Walker," she said cautiously, "you have a meeting in 15 minutes with the marketing team." Daniel looked up, his expression softer than usual. "Mia," he said, his voice uncharacteristically gentle, "can you reschedule that meeting?" "There's something I need to take care of first." Mia hesitated, clearly surprised by the change in his tone. "Of course, sir," she replied, stepping back out of the office. Once alone, Daniel opened his laptop and began typing an email to Grace Harper. He didn't know if she would respond, but he needed to apologize, not just for his behavior at Bravura, but for the deeper issues that had driven it. He poured his heart into the message, acknowledging his flaws and expressing his desire to learn from the experience. After hitting send, Daniel leaned back in his chair, exhaling deeply. It was a small step, but it felt significant. For the first time in years, he wasn't focused on his image or his bottom line. He was focused on becoming a better person, one decision at a time. In the days that followed, Daniel found himself replaying the events at Bravura in his mind. Each time he revisited the moment Grace stood before him, her calm composure in stark contrast to his arrogance, he felt a fresh wave of shame. But there was something else, a flicker of determination. He had spent years believing success meant dominance, control, and commanding attention. Now, for the first time, he wondered if he had been climbing the wrong mountain. Grace's influence lingered like an echo, her words nudging him toward introspection. He began to notice things he had previously ignored, like the way his assistant, Mia, always seemed hesitant when approaching him, as if bracing for criticism, or how his junior staff rarely shared their ideas in meetings, their voices drowned out by his overbearing presence. One morning, Daniel arrived at the office earlier than usual. The silence was almost disconcerting without the usual hum of ringing phones and hurried footsteps. He walked past the break room, where the faint aroma of brewing coffee reminded him of simpler days, back when he was just starting his career, and hadn't yet succumbed to the ego that now defined him. Spotting Mia already at her desk, he paused. She looked up, startled, clearly not expecting him to stop. "Mia," Daniel began awkwardly, his voice softer than usual. "Can I speak with you for a moment?" Her eyes widened slightly, but she nodded. "Of course, Mr. Walker." He gestured toward his office, and she followed him inside. As she sat across from his imposing mahogany desk, Daniel suddenly felt uncomfortably aware of the physical barriers he had created in his workspace, barriers that mirrored the emotional ones he had built over the years. "I owe you an apology," he said after a moment of hesitation. Mia blinked, her surprise evident. "Sir?" "For how I've treated you," Daniel clarified, his tone earnest. "I've been dismissive and difficult to work with. I know I haven't made this an easy environment for you, or anyone else, for that matter, and I want to change that." Mia stared at him for a long moment, as if trying to determine whether this was some kind of test. When she finally spoke, her voice was cautious but sincere. "Thank you, Mr. Walker. That means a lot. She hesitated, then continued. "I've always tried to do my best. But sometimes, it felt like nothing I did was good enough." Her words hit Daniel harder than he expected. He had always assumed his staff respected him, even admired him. But hearing this now made him realize how misguided he had been. "You're right," he admitted, his voice heavy with regret. "And I'm sorry. I don't expect forgiveness overnight, but I'll do whatever I can to earn it." Mia nodded, a faint smile tugging at her lips. For the first time in a long while, Daniel felt something resembling hope, a hope that perhaps it wasn't too late to rebuild the trust he had squandered. Later that day, Daniel received a reply to the email he had sent Grace. His heart pounded as he opened it, unsure of what to expect. "Mr. Walker," the message began, "I appreciate your apology. It takes courage to acknowledge one's mistakes, and I respect your willingness to do so. However, true growth isn't measured by words. It's measured by actions. If you're sincere in your desire to change, I encourage you to look beyond yourself and find ways to make a positive impact on those around you. Best regards, Grace Harper." The message was brief but powerful. Grace's words struck a chord deep within him. She wasn't interested in flattery or empty gestures. She wanted to see tangible proof that he had learned from his mistakes. And for the first time, Daniel felt a genuine desire to do just that. Not to impress anyone, but because it was the right thing to do. In the weeks that followed, Daniel began to make changes, both large and small. He started holding weekly one-on-one meetings with his staff, not to critique their work, but to listen, to truly hear their ideas, concerns, and aspirations. He implemented new initiatives aimed at fostering collaboration and recognizing contributions across all levels of the company. But the most significant change came when Daniel decided to step outside the confines of his corporate world. Inspired by Grace's email, he reached out to HeartReach, offering not just a financial donation, but also his time. He volunteered to mentor young entrepreneurs in underserved communities, sharing his knowledge while also learning from their perspectives. The first time he walked into a HeartReach seminar, Daniel felt out of place. The room was filled with bright-eyed individuals from diverse backgrounds, each brimming with potential and determination. It reminded him of his younger self, back when his ambitions were driven by passion rather than ego. Grace was there, of course, overseeing the program with her characteristic poise. When she saw Daniel enter, her expression was unreadable. But as he approached, she extended her hand, her gaze steady. "Mr. Walker," she said, her tone neutral. "I wasn't expecting to see you here." "I thought it was time I started acting on what I've learned," he replied, meeting her gaze with sincerity. "And please, call me Daniel." A small smile softened her features, and she nodded. "Welcome, Daniel. I hope you're ready to work." For the next several hours, Daniel immersed himself in the seminar, listening to the participants' stories and offering guidance where he could. It was humbling, challenging, and deeply rewarding. By the end of the day, he felt a sense of fulfillment he hadn't experienced in years, one that had nothing to do with power or prestige. As he left the HeartReach Center that evening, Daniel paused to look back at the building. The lights in the windows glowed warmly against the darkening sky, a beacon of hope and possibility. For the first time, he felt like he was part of something bigger than himself, something meaningful. Grace watched him from a distance, her arms crossed as she leaned against the doorway. She had seen many people come and go through HeartReach, each with their own motivations and intentions. But there was something different about Daniel now, a quiet determination that hadn't been there before. As he walked away, Grace allowed herself a small smile. Perhaps people could change, after all. Over the following months, Daniel's transformation became more than just a fleeting effort. It evolved into a way of life. The man who once measured success by his wealth and influence now found himself redefining it entirely. He didn't just show up for the HeartReach events out of obligation. He actively sought out ways to contribute meaningfully. Each seminar, workshop, and mentoring session challenged him in ways he hadn't anticipated. He discovered the complexities of struggles he'd once dismissed and the resilience of individuals who had faced adversities he couldn't imagine. The stories they shared of battling systemic inequality, overcoming personal loss, and striving for better futures humbled him. Daniel realized that his perception of hard work had been shallow, confined to boardrooms and profit margins. At HeartReach, Daniel began to see Grace in her element. She was a force of nature, encouraging, empathetic, and deeply invested in every person who walked through the doors. She knew every participant by name, their goals, their challenges, and even small details like the milestones of their children. Watching her lead with such selflessness left Daniel in awe, and it wasn't long before he sought her guidance. One late afternoon, after a particularly moving session with a group of young entrepreneurs, Daniel lingered in the HeartReach office. Most of the attendees had left, their laughter and chatter fading into the evening air. Grace stood by a window, her silhouette framed by the setting sun, reviewing paperwork with her characteristic focus. "Grace?" Daniel said hesitantly as he approached. She glanced up, her expression unreadable but not unkind. "Yes?" she replied, setting the papers aside. I wanted to thank you," he began, his voice unsteady. "Not just for giving me a chance to be part of this, but for opening my eyes. I never realized how narrow my perspective was, how much I've taken for granted." Grace studied him for a moment before responding. "Change isn't easy, Daniel. It takes more than just acknowledging past mistakes. It takes commitment, humility, and a willingness to listen." She paused, then added with a faint smile, "But I can see that you're trying." "That counts for something." Her words, though measured, struck a chord deep within him. Daniel nodded, his resolve hardening. "I'm not just trying. I want to do better, to be better. And not just for myself, but for the people I've let down along the way." Grace's smile widened slightly, and for the first time, Daniel felt he had earned a glimmer of her respect. One day, as Daniel sat in his office reviewing proposals, he received an unexpected email. It was from Marcus Darnell, the CEO who had witnessed his disgraceful behavior at Bravura months earlier. The subject line read, "A conversation worth having." Daniel's pulse quickened as he clicked on the message. "Daniel, I've been keeping an eye on your progress through HeartReach, and I've heard from Grace about the work you've been doing. I wanted to commend you for taking tangible steps to grow, not just as a businessman, but as a person. That being said, I believe it's time we revisited our discussion from Bravura. If you're willing, I'd like to meet next week to discuss a potential collaboration. Let me know your availability. Regards, Marcus Darnell." Daniel leaned back in his chair, the weight of Marcus's words settling over him. He couldn't help but feel a mix of relief and apprehension. Marcus's offer was an opportunity to redeem himself professionally, but it also came with an unspoken challenge, to prove that the changes he had made were genuine and lasting. The following week, Daniel found himself sitting across from Marcus in a sleek conference room at Axis Innovations. The meeting began with polite pleasantries, but it quickly delved into more serious matters. "Mr. Walker," Marcus began, his tone even but probing. "When we last spoke, I made it clear that respect and character are non-negotiable in any partnership I consider. I need to know, what's changed since then?" Daniel took a deep breath, his hands clasped on the table in front of him. "A lot has changed, Mr. Darnell, and it's not just about how I run my business. It's about how I live my life. I've learned that leadership isn't about commanding respect, it's about earning it. It's about lifting others up, not tearing them down." He paused, searching for the right words. "I know I have a long way to go, but I've made it my mission to listen, to learn, and to use my platform to create opportunities for others. The work I've been doing with HeartReach has shown me how much I have to learn, not just about business, but about humanity. I want to continue that work no matter where this partnership goes." Marcus regarded him carefully, his sharp eyes revealing little. Then, to Daniel's surprise, a faint smile tugged at the corners of his mouth. "That's a good answer," he said simply, "but let's see if your actions can back up your words." Over the next few months, Daniel worked tirelessly to prove himself, not just to Marcus, but to everyone who had placed their faith in him. He collaborated with Grace on a series of initiatives aimed at bridging the gap between corporations and underserved communities. These projects ranged from funding educational programs to creating mentorship opportunities for aspiring entrepreneurs. Though the work was demanding, Daniel found it deeply fulfilling. For the first time, his success felt like it had a purpose beyond personal gain. And while the accolades and recognition that came with these efforts were gratifying, they were no longer his primary motivation. One evening, after a long day of meetings and planning, Daniel found himself back at Bravura. The restaurant hadn't changed. The same elegant decor, the same air of exclusivity. But this time, Daniel felt like a different person entirely. As he sat at a quiet table near the window, he spotted Grace entering the restaurant. She caught his eye, and he stood to greet her, a genuine smile spreading across his face. "Grace?" he said warmly. "I didn't expect to see you here." She smiled back, her expression relaxed. "I could say the same to you." They ended up sharing a table, their conversation flowing easily as they reflected on the journey that had brought them to this point. For Daniel, it was a moment of quiet redemption, a reminder that even the deepest mistakes could lead to growth, so long as one was willing to do the work. As the evening wound down, Daniel raised his glass, a rare moment of sentimentality crossing his features. "To second chances," he said softly. Grace hesitated for a moment, then clinked her glass against his. "To second chances," she agreed, her smile genuine. Henry stood in his office, staring blankly at the glowing skyline outside his window. The city buzzed with life below, its neon lights flickering like the stars he hadn't looked at in years. In his mind, the image of Gloria's face at the restaurant played on repeat, calm, composed, yet heavy with disappointment. That look was worse than any angry confrontation could have been. It lingered in his thoughts, cutting deeper than he'd imagined possible. He turned back to his desk, where his phone sat idle, mocking him. He had picked it up at least 10 times that evening, scrolling to Gloria's contact before hesitating and setting it down again. What could he possibly say that would erase the shame he felt? The generic, "Sorry, I was a jerk," seemed insufficient, almost laughable. No words felt right. At least, none that could undo the humiliation he had caused her or repair the damage he had done. Finally, Henry sat down heavily in his chair. The weight of his guilt pressed on his chest like a physical force. He pulled his laptop closer, opened his email, and began typing an apology to Gloria. He wanted it to be heartfelt, but the more he wrote, the less authentic it seemed. "Dear Ms. Thompson, I would like to apologize sincerely for my behavior at the restaurant. It was unbecoming of me, and I deeply regret." Henry stopped typing and groaned, leaning back in frustration. The words felt stiff and artificial. Was he writing an apology or a corporate memo? He deleted the message and started again. "Gloria, I've been reflecting on my actions, and I realize—" Again, he paused, unable to continue. His hands hovered over the keyboard, then fell to his lap. The words on the screen felt hollow, their formality betraying his true emotions. With a frustrated sigh, Henry closed the laptop and buried his face in his hands. For days, the draft sat untouched. Henry avoided his office, canceling meetings and declining invitations to dinners and events he would have otherwise jumped at. He knew his behavior was slipping into avoidance, but he couldn't summon the energy to face the people who looked up to him, or rather, had looked up to him. His assistant's constant reminders of unreturned calls and ignored emails only deepened his dread. By the third day, Henry could no longer take the suffocating guilt. He made a decision that startled even himself. He would face Gloria in person. No emails, no intermediaries, just him, standing before her with nothing but an apology. The next morning, Henry found himself in the gleaming lobby of Gloria's office building. The space was pristine, buzzing with efficiency. As he approached the reception desk, he adjusted his tie for the 5th time, his nerves fraying. "Good morning," he said, his voice surprisingly shaky. "I'm here to see Ms. Thompson. I believe she's expecting me." The receptionist smiled politely and checked her records. "Yes, Mr. Stanford. Please take the elevator to the 12th floor. Her assistant will guide you from there." As the elevator doors slid shut, Henry's heart began to race. The polished interior reflected his image back at him. Immaculate suit, perfect posture, but the face of a man grappling with his own shortcomings. He realized, in that moment, how superficial that image had always been. When the elevator dinged and the doors opened, Gloria's assistant greeted him with a professional smile. "Mr. Stanford, Ms. Thompson is ready for you." She gestured toward the door at the end of the hall. Henry's palms were clammy as he approached. He paused outside the office, his hand hovering over the doorknob. The urge to flee surged through him, but he forced it down. This was his mess, and he needed to own it. He knocked softly. "Come in," Gloria's voice called out, calm and steady. Henry pushed the door open and stepped inside. Gloria sat at her desk, her expression unreadable as she watched him enter. "Mr. Stanford," she said, her tone neutral. "Please have a seat." "Thank you," Henry replied, his voice barely above a whisper as he lowered himself into the chair opposite her. The silence stretched between them, heavy with unspoken words. Henry shifted in his seat, trying to summon the courage to begin. "Ms. Thompson," he said finally, his voice cracking slightly. "I came here today because I owe you an apology, a real apology." Gloria folded her hands on the desk, her eyes never leaving his face. She didn't rush him, didn't fill the silence. She simply waited, giving him the space to find his words. Henry swallowed hard. "What I did at the restaurant was unforgivable. I was rude, arrogant, and completely out of line. You didn't deserve that. No one does. I'm ashamed of how I treated you." His eyes dropped to the polished wood of her desk. He couldn't bring himself to look at her as he continued. "The truth is, I've been blind to the way I've treated people. I've spent so much time focused on my own success that I stopped seeing others as people, as equals. That's a terrible thing to admit. But it's the truth." Henry finally raised his eyes to meet hers. "I've been reflecting on my behavior since that night, and I realize I've got a lot to learn about respect, empathy, and humility. I want to change, Ms. Thompson. Not just for the sake of business, but because I know I need to be a better person. For everyone." Gloria listened without interrupting, her expression giving nothing away. When he finished speaking, the silence stretched on, making Henry's pulse quicken. "Mr. Stanford?" Gloria said at last, her tone even. "I appreciate your apology. It's not easy to admit when we're wrong." Henry exhaled in relief, but Gloria wasn't finished. "However," she continued, "words are only the beginning. Change is measured by actions, not promises. If you truly want to be better, you'll need to prove it." Henry nodded vigorously. "I understand. I'm willing to do whatever it takes." Gloria regarded him thoughtfully, then leaned back in her chair. "There's a shelter I work with downtown, a place that helps families in need. They're always looking for volunteers. If you're serious about learning what it means to connect with people, to help without expecting anything in return, that's where you'll start." Henry blinked, taken aback. "A shelter?" he asked, his voice uncertain. "Yes," Gloria said firmly. "You'll see firsthand the impact of compassion and service. It's not glamorous and it's certainly not easy, but it will teach you something that no business deal ever could." Henry hesitated. The idea of volunteering at a shelter was foreign to him, far removed from his world of boardrooms and luxury. But as he looked into Gloria's steady gaze, he realized this was his chance, perhaps his only chance, to prove he was serious about changing. "Okay," he said finally. "I'll do it. When do I start?" Gloria's lips curved into the faintest hint of a smile. "I'll make the arrangements. Thank you for being willing to try, Mr. Stanford. It's a good first step." As Henry left Gloria's office, he felt a strange mix of anxiety and determination. The path ahead was uncertain, and he had no idea what to expect. But for the first time in a long time, he felt like he was heading in the right direction. Henry stepped into the shelter early the next morning, his shoes making soft but deliberate clicks on the scuffed linoleum floor. The air smelled faintly of cleaning products and coffee, and the quiet hum of conversation came from a nearby room. Henry paused at the reception desk, his nerves jangling. He hadn't felt this out of place in years. "Mr. Stanford?" A warm voice broke through his thoughts. Henry turned to see a woman in her late 50s with graying hair pulled back into a bun and kind eyes framed by glasses. She extended her hand. "I'm Linda, the volunteer coordinator. Welcome." "Thank you," Henry said, shaking her hand. I'm here to help." Linda's smile widened, though there was a hint of curiosity in her gaze. "We can always use extra hands around here. Let's get you started." As Linda led him through the shelter, Henry took in his surroundings. The walls were lined with posters bearing motivational quotes, photos of smiling families, and lists of community resources. Volunteers bustled about, organizing donations, preparing meals, and chatting with residents. "This is where we serve breakfast," Linda explained as they entered a large dining hall filled with round tables and folding chairs. "We also run workshops here during the day, resume writing, job skills, things like that. You'll be helping wherever we need an extra hand." Henry nodded, unsure what to say. Everything about this environment felt foreign. Yet, as he observed the volunteers working with quiet determination and the residents greeting one another with smiles, he felt a strange tug in his chest, a mixture of humility and curiosity. "Let's start you off in the kitchen," Linda said, handing him an apron. Henry blinked at the bright orange fabric, his tailored suit utterly out of place in the casual, utilitarian setting. Still, he slipped the apron over his head, tying it with a nervous knot. In the kitchen, Henry joined a small team of volunteers slicing fruit, flipping pancakes, and plating eggs. He kept his head down, listening to their easy banter but unsure how to join in. A tall man with a graying beard noticed his hesitance. "First time?" the man asked, handing Henry a tray of cutlery to set out. Henry nodded. "Is it that obvious?" The man chuckled. "Don't worry. You'll find your rhythm. I'm Paul, by the way." "Henry," he replied, placing forks and knives beside plates with more care than was necessary. Paul gave him an encouraging pat on the back before returning to the griddle. Henry continued his task, trying to focus on the simplicity of it. Each movement felt strangely meditative, a reprieve from the constant noise of his usual life. By the time breakfast was served, Henry's initial discomfort had begun to ebb. He stood near the serving counter, watching as residents filled their plates. Each interaction was brief, yet there was a warmth and familiarity between the volunteers and the people they served that Henry couldn't ignore. "Thank you, sir," a young mother said, balancing a tray of food while holding the hand of a toddler. Her voice was soft, her gratitude genuine. "You're welcome," Henry said, his voice almost catching. As the day went on, Henry found himself assigned to a variety of tasks, sorting clothing donations, organizing a storage room, and assisting in a children's art class. Each activity brought him closer to the people who relied on the shelter. He listened to their stories, some heartbreaking, others hopeful. One man, James, had lost his job and his home after a long illness left him unable to work. He spoke of his plans to rebuild, to find stable employment and reconnect with his estranged family. Henry found himself nodding along, deeply moved by James's resilience. In the children's art class, Henry met Elena, a 10-year-old with bright eyes and a mischievous grin. She was drawing a picture of a house surrounded by flowers. "That's beautiful," Henry said, crouching beside her. "Are those your favorite flowers?" Elena nodded. "Daisies. My mom says they mean hope. We're going to have a garden full of them when we get a new house." Henry felt a lump in his throat. "I'm sure you will." As the day came to a close, Henry stood near the shelter's entrance, watching families leave. He felt exhausted, but it was a different kind of exhaustion, one that came from effort that mattered. Linda approached, a knowing smile on her face. "So, how was your first day?" "It was—" Henry searched for the right word. "Eye-opening, humbling." Linda nodded. "That's how it starts. The important thing is to keep showing up." Henry smiled faintly. "I plan to." The next few weeks brought a rhythm to Henry's visits to the shelter. He started volunteering several times a week, gradually becoming more comfortable with the tasks and more connected to the people. He found himself looking forward to the mornings spent flipping pancakes with Paul, organizing supplies with Linda, or helping the children with their schoolwork. One day, as Henry was assisting with a computer skills workshop, he noticed a man sitting in the corner, his shoulders hunched and his gaze fixed on the floor. Henry recognized him from previous visits, but had never seen him join any activities. "Mind if I sit here?" Henry asked, pulling up a chair. The man glanced at him but said nothing. "I'm Henry," he continued. "What's your name?" "Daryl," the man muttered after a long pause. "Nice to meet you, Daryl," Henry said. "You come here often?" Daryl shrugged. "Sometimes. Not much else to do." Henry leaned forward, his tone gentle. "I noticed you sitting alone. Is there something on your mind?" Daryl hesitated, then let out a heavy sigh. "Just trying to figure out how to start over. Lost my job, my house, everything. Feels like no matter what I do, it's never enough." Henry nodded, his chest tightening. He thought of the times he'd dismissed people in Daryl's position, assuming their struggles were the result of laziness or poor choices. Now, sitting face to face with a man burdened by circumstances beyond his control, Henry felt the weight of his own ignorance. "I can't imagine how hard that must be," Henry said. "But starting over doesn't mean you're starting from nothing. You've got experience, skills, and a willingness to keep trying. That's worth a lot." Daryl looked at him, his eyes softening slightly. "You think so?" "I know so," Henry replied. One evening, after a long day at the shelter, Henry found himself sitting at home, reflecting on the changes he'd experienced. His once immaculate apartment, filled with expensive furniture and art, now felt hollow. The possessions that had once symbolized his success seemed meaningless compared to the connections he'd made at the shelter. His phone buzzed, and he glanced at the screen. It was an email from Gloria. "Henry, Linda has been singing your praises. She says you've been a tremendous help at the shelter and that the residents appreciate your presence. I wanted to let you know how proud I am of the effort you've put in. I believe people can change when they truly commit to it. You're proving that to be true. Best, Gloria." Henry read the email twice, a smile spreading across his face. Her words filled him with a sense of validation and encouragement he hadn't realized he needed. Over the coming months, Henry's involvement in the shelter grew. He began taking on more responsibilities, organizing fundraising events and coordinating workshops to help residents build skills for the future. His efforts didn't go unnoticed. Linda often pulled him aside to express her gratitude, and the residents began greeting him with smiles and familiarity. But more importantly, Henry noticed a shift within himself. The arrogance and self-importance that had once defined him were being replaced by humility and compassion. He no longer saw people as categories or statistics, but as individuals with unique stories and dreams. One day, as he was leaving the shelter, he spotted Daryl at a nearby bus stop, holding a folder of documents. "Daryl," Henry called out, jogging over. "How's it going?" Daryl grinned, holding up the folder. "Got a job interview today. It's not much, but it's a start." "That's amazing," Henry said, clapping him on the shoulder. "Good luck. You've got this." Daryl nodded, his expression filled with a mixture of hope and determination. As Henry watched the bus pull away, he felt a deep sense of pride, not in himself, but in the resilience of the people he'd come to know. They had shown him the power of perseverance and the importance of lifting others up. As Henry continued volunteering, he became a fixture at the shelter. Residents and staff alike grew accustomed to his presence, and many began to confide in him. His once intimidating demeanor had softened, replaced by a warmth and approachability that surprised even himself. One afternoon, Henry was tasked with organizing a job readiness seminar. He worked with Linda to invite local professionals to lead sessions on resume writing, interview techniques, and career planning. As he stood at the front of the room introducing the speakers, he couldn't help but feel a surge of pride. "This seminar is about more than just finding a job," he said, addressing the group of residents seated before him. "It's about giving you the tools and confidence to chase your dreams. You're capable of incredible things, and I hope today helps you take that next step." As the seminar progressed, Henry moved through the room, offering encouragement and advice to participants. He paused at a table where Elena, the young girl who loved daisies, sat with her mother. "Henry," Elena said brightly, holding up a worksheet filled with her carefully written answers. "Look, I wrote down what I want to be when I grow up." Henry crouched beside her, smiling. "Let's see." Elena pointed to her paper, where she had written, "I want to be a teacher because teachers help kids like me." "That's a wonderful goal," Henry said, his voice soft with emotion. "And I have no doubt you'll be an amazing teacher someday." Her mother, sitting beside her, gave Henry a grateful smile. "You've been such a positive influence on her," she said quietly. "Thank you." Henry felt his throat tighten. "It's been an honor," he replied, his words heartfelt. One evening, as Henry was preparing to leave the shelter, Linda approached him with a clipboard. "Henry, we're hosting our annual benefit gala next month," she said. "It's one of our biggest events of the year, and we'd love for you to be involved." Henry hesitated. The thought of attending a formal event, even one for a cause he cared about, felt daunting, but he nodded, determined to continue his commitment. "I'd be happy to help," he said. Linda's face lit up. "Wonderful. We'll need sponsors, auction items, and of course someone to share their story during the program. You'd be perfect for that last part." Henry's eyes widened. "Me? Speak at the gala?" "You've become an important part of this community, Henry," Linda said. "Your story could inspire others to get involved." Though nervous, Henry agreed. Over the next few weeks, he worked tirelessly to prepare for the event. He reached out to his business contacts, securing donations and auction items. He even persuaded a few of his former colleagues to attend, knowing their support could make a significant difference. When the night of the gala arrived, Henry stood backstage, adjusting his tie and rehearsing his speech in his head. The grand ballroom was filled with elegantly dressed guests, the atmosphere buzzing with excitement. As Linda introduced him, Henry took a deep breath and stepped onto the stage. The applause that greeted him was warm and encouraging, but it did little to calm his nerves. "Good evening," he began, his voice steady despite his racing heart. "My name is Henry Stanford, and I want to share a story with you, a story about change, humility, and the power of community." He spoke about his journey, from the arrogance and prejudice that had defined him to the humbling experiences at the shelter that had opened his eyes. He shared stories of the residents who had inspired him, their resilience and determination serving as a testament to the strength of the human spirit. "When I first walked through the doors of this shelter," Henry said, his voice thick with emotion, "I thought I was coming here to help, but the truth is I've been the one who's been helped. The people I've met here have shown me what it truly means to be human. They've taught me lessons I'll carry for the rest of my life." The audience was silent, captivated by his words. As Henry finished his speech, the room erupted in applause. He stepped off the stage, his chest heaving with a mix of relief and gratitude. Gloria was waiting for him near the edge of the stage, her eyes shining with pride. "That was incredible, Henry," she said. "Thank you," he replied, his voice trembling slightly. "I couldn't have done this without you, Gloria. You're the one who gave me a second chance." Gloria shook her head. "You gave yourself that chance, Henry, and you've made the most of it." The gala was a resounding success, raising more funds than any previous year. Henry felt a deep sense of fulfillment as he watched the guests mingling, their support ensuring that the shelter could continue its vital work. In the weeks that followed, Henry's involvement at the shelter grew even deeper. He began mentoring residents one-on-one, helping them develop plans for their futures. He also started attending community meetings, advocating for policies that would address the root causes of homelessness and poverty. Through it all, Henry maintained his humility, never forgetting the lessons he had learned. His relationships with the residents, staff, and volunteers became a source of joy and inspiration, grounding him in ways he had never experienced before. One sunny afternoon, Henry arrived at the shelter to find Linda waiting for him with a wide smile. "Henry, "There's someone here to see you," she said, her tone teasing. Curious, Henry followed her to the common room, where he saw Malik sitting at a table, his arms crossed and a sly grin on his face. Beside him stood a well-dressed man holding a briefcase. "Malik," Henry said, his brow furrowing in confusion. "What's going on?" Malik stood and gestured to the man beside him. "Mr. Henry, this is Mr. Carter. He's a lawyer. I'm getting adopted." Henry's eyes widened, his chest swelling with emotion. "Adopted?" Malik nodded, his grin growing wider. "I'm finally getting a real family." Henry knelt beside him, placing a hand on his shoulder. "Malik, that's amazing. I'm so happy for you." The boy's grin faltered for a moment, replaced by a look of vulnerability. "I'm gonna miss you, though," he admitted. Henry swallowed the lump in his throat. "I'm gonna miss you too, buddy, but this is a new chapter for you and you're going to do great things. I know it." As Malik threw his arms around him, Henry hugged him tightly, his heart full of pride and sadness. Months turned into a year, and Henry's journey of transformation continued. The shelter became a second home, its residents and staff a second family. His relationship with Gloria deepened, their mutual respect and shared values forming the foundation of a true partnership. One evening, as Henry stood outside the shelter watching the sunset, Gloria joined him. "You've come a long way, Henry," she said, her voice warm. "I couldn't have done it without you," he replied, glancing at her. Gloria smiled. "I think you would have found your way eventually, but I'm glad I could help." Henry nodded, his gaze returning to the horizon. "I used to think success was about power, wealth, and recognition, but now I see it's about the lives we touch and the change we create." Gloria placed a hand on his shoulder. "And you're creating that change, Henry. Every single day." As the sun dipped below the skyline, Henry felt a profound sense of peace. He knew his journey wasn't over. There was still so much to learn, so much to do. But for the first time, he felt truly aligned with his purpose, ready to face whatever came next. Henry's life had transformed in ways he never thought possible. The man who once saw the world through a lens of arrogance and privilege now moved with purpose and humility. His mornings at the shelter became as routine as his once-daily meetings with corporate executives. The difference was that these mornings filled him with meaning rather than hollow accomplishments. One day, Linda approached Henry as he was organizing a shipment of donations. Her usual warm smile had a touch of mischief. "You've got a visitor," she said, jerking her head toward the entrance. Henry turned to see Gloria standing in the doorway, her posture poised and confident. She wore a simple yet elegant dress, a testament to her understated power. "Gloria," Henry said, wiping his hands on a nearby cloth. "What brings you here?" She smiled faintly. "I thought it was time I saw for myself how you've been doing." Linda chuckled, stepping aside. "He's one of our best, I'll tell you that." Gloria's smile deepened. "I'm not surprised." As they walked through the shelter together, Gloria listened intently as Henry pointed out the changes he had helped implement. Improved storage systems for donations, expanded outreach programs, and new job training workshops. "It's impressive," Gloria admitted. "You've clearly poured your heart into this place." "It's not just me," Henry said quickly. "The team here is incredible. I've learned more from them than I could ever give back." They paused near the children's area, where Elena was drawing at a small table. She looked up and beamed when she saw Henry. "Mr. Henry, come look." Henry knelt beside her, and Gloria watched as he admired the bright daisies she had sketched. "They're beautiful, Elena," he said, ruffling her hair. Elena's mother approached, giving Gloria a polite nod before turning to Henry. "Thank you again for everything you've done for us," she said. "We're moving into transitional housing next week. It's a big step, but I don't think we could have done it without your help." Henry shook his head, humbled. "You're the one who did the hard work. I just cheered from the sidelines." As the mother and daughter walked away, Gloria turned to Henry, her expression unreadable. "I have to admit, I didn't expect to see you like this." Henry chuckled softly. "Neither did I." Later that evening, Gloria invited Henry to dinner at a small restaurant she frequented. It was a cozy, unassuming place, worlds apart from the high-end establishments Henry used to prefer. As they sat across from each other, Gloria studied him thoughtfully. "You've changed, Henry," she said, her voice low but firm. "Not just in how you act, but in how you see the world. It's remarkable." Henry stirred his coffee, a hint of a smile on his lips. "I owe much of that to you. If you hadn't called me out, if you hadn't pushed me to confront myself, I don't think I'd be here today." Gloria tilted her head slightly. "But you didn't just stop at acknowledging your mistakes. You acted on them, that's what matters." Henry looked at her, his expression serious. "Do you ever think about how many people we've judged unfairly? How many chances we've missed to help someone because we didn't take the time to understand them?" "All the time," Gloria admitted. "That's why I do this work, because change starts with awareness, and then action." They sat in companionable silence for a moment, the weight of their conversation settling over them. "You know," Henry said finally, "I used to think I was successful because of my wealth and reputation. But now I see success differently. It's about what we give, not what we take." Gloria nodded, her eyes shining with approval. "Exactly." The months rolled on, and Henry's transformation continued to ripple outward. His work at the shelter not only impacted the lives of the residents, but also inspired others in his network. Former colleagues and business associates began reaching out, curious about the changes they'd seen in him. At first, Henry was hesitant to share his story. It felt deeply personal, and he worried that people might see it as performative. But as Gloria reminded him, sharing his journey could inspire others to reflect on their own actions and choices. One afternoon, Henry agreed to speak at a conference on corporate responsibility. The room was filled with professionals from various industries, all eager to learn about integrating social impact into their businesses. Standing at the podium, Henry took a deep breath. "When I was first asked to speak here," he began, "I didn't think I was qualified. After all, my track record in this area isn't exactly spotless. But that's the thing about growth. It's messy. It requires us to confront uncomfortable truths about ourselves and be willing to change." He spoke candidly about his past mistakes, the night at the restaurant that served as his wake-up call, and the lessons he'd learned through his work at the shelter. "The most important thing I've learned," he concluded, "is that success is hollow without purpose, and purpose comes from serving others, not just ourselves." The audience erupted in applause, and Henry felt a mixture of relief and gratitude. It wasn't about the recognition, it was about the hope that his words might spark change in someone else. One day, as Henry walked into the shelter, Linda greeted him with a wide grin. "We got a surprise for you," she said, leading him into the common room. Henry's breath caught as he saw Malik standing there, dressed in a crisp school uniform and holding a small gift bag. "Malik," Henry exclaimed. "What are you doing here?" Malik grinned, his eyes sparkling. "I wanted to say thank you." He handed Henry the gift bag, and inside was a framed photo of the two of them at the shelter, surrounded by the other children. Beneath it, in bold letters, were the words, "Thank you for being our friend." Henry felt tears prick at his eyes as he hugged Malik tightly. "You've taught me more than I could ever teach you, kid," he said, his voice thick with emotion. As the years went by, Henry's legacy grew, not in terms of wealth or accolades, but in the lives he touched. The shelter expanded its programs, thanks in part to his continued support and advocacy. He became a mentor to countless individuals, guiding them not just in their careers, but in finding their purpose. Gloria remained a steadfast presence in his life, their partnership evolving into a deep friendship built on mutual respect and shared values. Together, they launched new initiatives that addressed systemic issues, creating lasting change in their community. One evening, As Henry stood on the rooftop of his building, gazing out at the city lights, he thought about the man he used to be. The arrogance, the blind ambition, the disregard for others, it all felt like a lifetime ago. He turned to Gloria, who had joined him on the rooftop, and smiled. "You were right," he said softly. "About what?" she asked, raising an eyebrow. "About everything," he replied. "About humility, about growth, about what really matters." Gloria smiled back, her gaze steady. "I had faith in you, Henry, and you proved me right." As they stood together, watching the city below, Henry felt a profound sense of peace. He knew the journey wasn't over, but he also knew he was on the right path, a path of purpose, connection, and redemption.